It's 10 years in jail for self-styled Godman Ram Rahim Singh.
बाबा राम रहीम जिस नाम से दुनिया उसे जानती थी, गुरमीत सिंह अब 20 साल जेल समर्थन में शहरों को जलते हुए
Complete breakdown of law and order. Even now, these politicians will want that Ram Rahim can be used for political advantage once again.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. Judgment Day for India's Godman. Are the news media there up to the job of covering religious figures with such huge followings? Please show your ID. Chinese censors go after online anonymity. Robert Mugabe, 37 years in power, much of it at odds with journalists.
Who are you? You bloody idiots!
But in some ways, they need each other. And if you're feeling down after last night's terror attack, there's always the Muslim morning after kit. India is still dealing with the fallout from last weekend when 38 people were killed as protests turned violent after a prominent sect leader, Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh, was convicted of raping 2 of his female followers. Singh, or Ram Rahim as he is more commonly known, leads the Dera Sacha Sauda, a religious order that claims as many as 60 million followers. Singh is a flamboyant character who has used the Indian airwaves to build a one-man publicity machine. Not just mainstream media, he produces and stars in his own films. He is what Indians call a godman, one of many, and Singh's case has shed a light on how sect leaders conduct themselves and how they're presented in the Indian media. The so-called godmen have vast, devoted followings that, as last weekend proved, are capable of violence. They tend to have friends in high political places, and journalists have reason to fear criticizing them. The reporter who first broke the story of Singh's sexual misconduct back in 2002 was shot dead and quickly. Singh goes on trial next month for alleged involvement in that murder. Our starting point this week is the Indian city where the verdict came down, Panchkula.
A huge convoy of cars has left Jazeera for...
The saturation coverage of this story began as the defendant, accompanied by a 200-car motorcade, headed to the courthouse where he would be found guilty of rape. Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh is no recluse, no stranger to the news media. Godmen, or Babas as they are known, are fixtures on the Indian airwaves. And that's been the case for Singh, despite the fact that the rape allegations, as well as suspicions that he ordered the killing of a journalist, have been hanging over his head for 15 years now.
When these media outlets were gloating about Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh and were busy promoting his movies, they knew this man has been accused of killing a journalist, is accused of rapes, accused of extortion and other illegal activities. But they agreed to take him on news channels.
We, especially the Hindi channels in our country, play a very bad role in this.
Guruji, Baba Ram Rahim. Gurmeet ji, swagat hai aapka.
Most of these Babas, we give them prime time slots. We promote them, we build them up. We push them and push them and push them to the level where they completely, are all pervasive in public consciousness.
Anyone who violates law needs to be scrutinized. It's as simple as that. But the problem is, just like the followers, both the media and the police treat Godmen as God. That's the story.
Or at least it was in Singh's case until he was actually convicted. He was airlifted from the court to prison. The authorities were well aware that 100,000 of his devotees had flooded into the city of Panchkula for the verdict. The Indian news media were among the targets of their wrath. Singh's followers may have felt betrayed because the moment he was found guilty, Indian news channels suddenly found their voice. It's as though, in the eyes of most of the media, Singh went from godman to sexual predator overnight, even though it's been 15 years since the allegations against him first surfaced.
मैं समर्थन नहीं कर रहा हूं कि इस तरह के हमले जायज हैं किसी भी तरह के
I am neither condoning nor justifying these attacks, but the media need to understand that brainwashing audiences 365 days of the year will come back to bite them one day. So this attack on the media was not because of their impartial and courageous journalism. If they were indeed doing impartial and courageous journalism, this story would not have taken so long to come out.
Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh's story is pretty important and significant. It tells us many things about many aspects of Indian politics and Indian media. The media ignores the crimes and other criminal depredations of people who style themselves as Godmen. That's what it tells us. And media, just like the politicians, are afraid of the audience reactions.
The ultimate fear is the fate that befell Chandra Chatrapati, the journalist who way back in 2002 first exposed the sexual assault allegations against Singh and who swiftly paid for that with his life. It is notable that Chatrapati did not work for a national newspaper or news channel. He was with a small regional paper called Purasach. It seems the bigger the news outlet, the less likely it is to report critically on the Baba phenomenon. The best-known Babas, names like Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Jagi Vasudev, and Baba Ramdev, have enormous followings. And despite the shady dealings attached to each of their names, media outlets which are ratings-driven and circulation-obsessed are as leery of alienating them and their devotees as Indian politicians are.
As
soon as you begin to wield influence over a mass of people, you start attracting the attention of political parties who want to align with you. And this is when the mainstream media get involved. To most people, the Baba is a holy spiritual leader, but in reality, he represents a lucrative revenue structure. And wherever there's a revenue structure, the mainstream media will invariably follow.
These are all media-created Babas. I mean, it's very easy for a TV channel to give half an hour slots or an hour slot to any Baba and still, get a huge viewership. It's television on the cheap. Why make an effort when you can put a Baba on show, doing yoga or doing anything? Other than that, of course, the fact that the Babas are extremely powerful because of their nexus with politics.
Once these Godmen have the patronage of political parties and political parties are connected with editors, you know how system works. I mean, if you are doing that story, that Godman will call that politician, this politician will call your editor. Okay, I got a call from such and such person. He's saying, are you doing some story against this editor? This Godman or something? Just be cautious. So it happens. It really happens now. It's a reality in newsroom.
Editors routinely reject all ideas of any stories to investigate Godmen, or they are afraid of losing potential readers. And these Godmen have links with politicians, so the reasons are multifaceted. So we end up having very little or no investigation into Godmen of this country.
Instead of providing critical coverage of Godmen, acting as arm's-length intermediaries, most of the Indian media treat them with reverence. It adds up to an institutional failing on the part of the Fourth Estate, for reasons that range from the economic to the political.
What is our job? Our job is to speak truth to power. Did we ever question when Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, lauded him on Twitter, where he's the most followed person, that why is our Prime Minister extending such support to a rape accused? None of us raised that. It's only after the court came near a conviction that we got into this, very hysterical, totally over-the-top coverage. So the media, we need to ask ourselves as to what is our role in building up these people.
This is such a piece of drama. For the mainstream media, it's business as usual, reporting as they like. Only when they come under attack do they start questioning themselves and soul-searching. Suddenly, they're reminded that they are the fourth pillar of a democracy. Of course, journalists who report on these Godmen are wary of the backlash, but if they produce critical journalism which gets traction in the media, it will chip away at the strength of the Godman's following. So journalists need to take such risks.
One journalist did. He was killed over the story. It's the second part of that equation, the getting traction across the media part, that did not happen. Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh has another court date upcoming in that murder case. And the trial of the Indian news media, the big media, continues. Other media stories that are on our radar this week. China is on a censorship roll ahead of the upcoming 19th Congress of the ruling Communist Party. Having recently changed the rules on what VPNs web users can legally use, the authorities are now turning to the issue of online anonymity. Beijing's Cybersecurity Administration has announced a new law effective October 1st, requiring all online commenters to verify their identities, their real names, before posting. Platforms affected include online forums, news websites, mobile apps, and social media platforms. Back in 2012, the authorities forced Sina Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, to require users to identify themselves. And this new law requires all companies, regardless of size, to fall into line or to remove their interactive features altogether. Ukraine has deported 3 journalists in the space of just a few days as Kiev continues to take a hard line on what it calls anti-Ukrainian propaganda. Spanish journalists Antonio Pampliega and Angel Sastre were denied entry at the airport in Kiev August 25th. The Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, has banned them for 3 years. The journalists had produced stories of Ukrainian troops shelling civilian areas in the east of the country. Reporting, the SBU says, is one-sided and misleading. A few days later, Anna Kurbatova, a reporter for the Russian state-owned broadcaster Channel 1, was snatched off a street in Kiev by security agents, deported, and also banned for 3 years. Kurbatova had been in the country for less than a month, but had already shown up on a list posted on Miro Tvorets, a nationalist website that tracks and harasses journalists it does not like. Miro Tvorets called Kurbatova an enemy of Ukraine for producing pro-Russian propaganda. Rupert Murdoch's company, 21st Century Fox, has taken his controversial Fox News channel off the air in the UK. And given that Murdoch's British operations are currently under the microscope, he's picked an interesting time to do it. 21st Century Fox said it pulled the news channel from its Sky platform, which it partly owns, because of poor ratings, just 2,000 viewers a day. But Fox News had been on the UK airwaves for 15 years. It never had good ratings. And it disappears just as regulators and politicians are deciding whether to rubber stamp 21st Century Fox's attempt to take over the 61% of Sky it does not already own. Parliamentarians, unions, and media activists have all said the £11 billion deal should be killed because the Murdochs already control too much of the British media landscape, including more than 1/3 of the newspaper market. A spokesman for 21st Century Fox says the decision to drop Fox News in Great Britain has nothing to do with the Sky bid. Grace Mugabe, the wife of the Zimbabwean president Robert Mugabe, got some bad press in South Africa recently after reportedly assaulting a woman in Johannesburg. President Mugabe's response to the story was typical. He played the race card, asking why whites in South Africa still wield so much power. The president's reaction fits a pattern of deflection he has used ever since coming into office in 1980, ending decades of colonial white minority rule. The media landscape Mugabe inherited was tightly controlled by his predecessor, Ian Smith. It reflected white interests, and a transformation was in order. But Mugabe did not reverse Smith's media policies. He adopted most of them, leaving the landscape tightly controlled. One of the most racially charged stories of the Mugabe era was his implementation of radical land reform starting back in 2000. Many farms owned by whites were expropriated without compensation and given to black Zimbabweans. Mugabe saw a racial element, particularly in the international news coverage of that story, that he would exploit. He called the criticism he was getting a threat to Zimbabwe's sovereignty, a tactic he uses to this very day. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Harare on Africa's oldest sitting president and the media legacy he will leave behind.
Even as a revolutionary, Robert Mugabe understood the power of the media. While in exile in neighboring Mozambique in the 1970s, Mugabe would spend hours on the radio broadcasting speeches back into what was then called Rhodesia, calling for the end of white minority rule and positioning himself as a leader who could stand up to imperialism.
The enemy we are fighting is not just Ian Smith and his regime. It is Ian Smith, the British, the Americans, the French, the West Germans, and the Zionists.
After negotiating independence in 1979, Mugabe would return home the next year to a hero's welcome. More than 200,000 Zimbabweans turned up to see a man whom they'd hardly seen for years, not in person or in the media.
The Rhodesian government had banned even showing his photograph. So this mystical figure And when he arrives here, it was a momentous occasion. I would say that the Rhodesians helped to build his mystique, and therefore profound significance as a new leader for Zimbabwe.
The only time when coverage of Mugabe or ZANU-PF was deemed to be acceptable was when it was negative. Otherwise, there was no coverage. And in the little coverage that was published, he was routinely referred to as a terrorist leader.
Despite constantly being branded a terrorist, Mugabe had the backing of the people, and come the country's first democratic election in 1980, he became the country's first black prime minister. Given Mugabe's vilification in the Rhodesian media under Smith, he moved quickly to transform the Zimbabwean media.
One of the main aims of media policy after independence was, to use Mugabe's words, to decolonize broadcasting and print media institutions.
My fellow Zimbabweans,
and it was really important for them to fight media imperialism more broadly. So they decided to transform the national broadcaster and also to gain ownership over the Rhodesia printing and publishing company that owned the majority of newspaper titles during the Rhodesian era.
It was a private company in which majority shareholding was vested in a South African company called the Argus Media Group. So the main Zimbabwean newspaper publishing company was actually controlled from outside the country. Their news coverage was sympathetic to white interests. So his first agenda was to seek to wrest that control from foreign ownership in South Africa.
The Nigerians helped us to buy the Zim papers from Argus Press, £5 million. The Nigerians brought the money by plane. The Nigerians were part of the frontline states with the liberation struggle. They trained many of our fighters. So this would have been a continuation of that trend. It appeared imperative then that the new government should have a media outlet.
For the most part, Mugabe did not implement the proposed media reforms that many had hoped for, but instead adopted the same methods of control exercised by his predecessor. The Rhodesian Broadcasting Corporation became the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, the ZBC. It remains the country's only domestic TV channel and is staunchly pro-Mugabe. The Rhodesian Herald became the Herald. It is the most widely circulated newspaper in the country and offers equally effusive coverage. Land reform, many years into Mugabe's rule, remained a highly politicized issue. Most of the farmland in a country known as the breadbasket of Africa was still white-owned. Critics were saying that Mugabe's government was coming up short on the land issue, that farms were going to the politically connected few and not to the people. By the late 1990s, Mugabe's popularity was on the wane, so under increasing political pressure, he endorsed the seizure of white-owned land, a move that put Zimbabwe back into the global headlines.
You are not wanted to be here anymore.
By the year 2000, foreign journalists came streaming back into the country to cover President Mugabe's controversial land reform program. White commercial farms were being expropriated and supposedly redistributed amongst previously disadvantaged black Zimbabweans. But it was the focus, the framing of that story in the international media, particularly the British press, that many Zimbabweans say played into the narrative that President Mugabe was formulating. A narrative that would help to keep him in power for many years to come.
For the death of a white farmer over the weekend. The incident unfolded from about 6:30 local time here in Harare.
The global media representation of the Zimbabwe crisis in the early 2000s was often presented as a racial conflict between white farmers and a black government. And this was helpful to the Zimbabwean government in many ways because it allowed them to prove that Britain was mainly interested in Zimbabwe because of the white population.
So one would have expected a more balanced view of the land reform as part of the decolonization process, but no. The media went wild, the British media in particular, and highlighted the atrocities against the whites, more than those against the black workers on those farms. So it became a spectacle to put in the front page of British newspapers or electronic media a white who has been battered or killed.
As I recall having a conversation with a news agency correspondent based in Harare, and he said, you know, if I supply a story to my editor with a headline, "White farmer killed by violent black squatter," I'm on the wire. I'm going to have my story featured in the international press. So certainly the way in which race played a part should not be underestimated.
That white families were being kicked off their farms, often violently and without compensation, was a big news story. But the international media's fixation on the white farmers showed a bias. For Mugabe, it was a bias that was easy to exploit. He would ban news outlets like the BBC, calling its journalists agents sent by Britain to destabilize Zimbabwe, turning what should have been legitimate criticism of his government into a supposed imperial threat that he knew would resonate with his voter base and reinforce his leadership.
Let them please leave us alone. We are Zimbabweans, not Britons.
If the foreign press had adopted an even-handed approach, comprehensively looking at each and every aspect of that problem, in order to present a fair and balanced dissemination of news,
We don't want any photo here.
they would undermine the president of Zimbabwe by removing the carpet from under his feet.
Mugabe's relationship with the British media would become outwardly hostile.
What have the British to do with Zimbabwe? Who are you? You bloody idiots.
But, in a way, symbiotic. He gives journalists an easy story to cover, the well-worn cliché of an archetypal African dictator, and they in turn provide him with an easy target.
Journalists, tell those you are representing that the Robert Mugabe is still here, well and strong.
Allowing him to dust off his old anti-imperialist credentials, to distract Zimbabweans from the real story, what the country has become under his leadership.
Finally, there's this syndrome that Muslim Americans must deal with after something like a terror attack and the news coverage that ensues. How to respond to questions about something they had absolutely nothing to do with. The Egyptian satirist Bassem Youssef might have the answer. He's teamed up with a US-based entertainment site called Cafe, and they've come up with what they call the Muslim Morning After Kit. The kit contains a few items that will be of help not only for Muslims, but also for Americans who, as the video puts it, vaguely look like Muslims. It's nice to see Bassem Youssef back doing his thing, albeit in English. From 2011 to 2014, his Cairo-based comedy program, El Bernameg, was extraordinarily popular with Egyptians, until, under the Sisi government, the authorities there lost their sense of humor, and Youssef left the country. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Introducing the Muslim Morning After Kit.
The Muslim Morning After Kit comes with American flags to drape over your house in every direction, a t-shirt to remind people you're one of the good ones, a CD with all your exercises for sounding like a white person.
Damn, son.
A framed picture of you and Toby Keith. Toby Keith is an American country music singer, and if you order now, we'll throw in a keychain with an audio recording to help you get out of tough situations.
Hey, tell him.
I hereby condemn yesterday's terrorist attack and all terrorist attacks. Bye-bye.
That'll do. For now.
Bye-bye.
Awesome G, this is great for Muslims, but what about me? I'm not Muslim, I just look like one.
Don't worry, Baba G. I've got just the thing for you.
Indian Sikhs, Armenian Christians, Persian Jews, Syrian Catholics, Latinos,
black people who happen to look Middle Eastern. We've heard your concerns, and this is why we're pleased to announce
the debut of the vaguely Muslim-looking Morning After Kit.
For anyone who looks a little bit Muslimy.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. It's just, I thought.
Don't worry. Happens all the time.
See, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or not. You really need this. We all really need this.
Thanks, vaguely Muslim-looking morning after kit.